Hi, what's up? Hello, my name is Liz, and you're watching For Booking Out Loud. So, I've actually thought of doing this video for quite a while. I enjoy nonfiction. It's one of my favorite genres to dive into, and especially as Nonfiction November came up, because we're not already halfway over, but I digress. I was like, I gotta put this out there. I have so many I love and enjoy, but I kept putting it off and off just because how do you rate nonfiction books? I have a hard time myself just rating the books, much less pitting them against each other, because there's just so many different types. You have memoirs, you have historical nonfiction, you have educational nonfiction, you have just nonfiction about different topics, and if you're trying to compare all of them, you just can't. It's such a personal thing. And to compare a nonfiction about genocide to pirates, is that even doable? Well, clearly I am, and clearly people have before, but I kind of came to a conclusion while preparing for this video that instead of doing like my top 10 nonfiction, I'm just gonna do my top nonfiction and revisit this every so often. And especially because I know my nonfiction is very narrow. I'm someone who, yes, enjoys nonfiction, but I enjoy a certain type of nonfiction because I go on these like spirals when I do nonfiction reads. Like, for example, one of my favorite books currently sitting in my top 10 is 5 Days at Memorial, which is about Hurricane Katrina. And I can go back on my Goodreads and see how many books on Hurricane Katrina I read at the time, spiraling. Or sometimes I'll go on a memoir kick and spiral on memoirs. Or more recently, some of you may have noticed, I've been reading a ton of books on racism in the United States, which is kind of a spiral, right? And that's not bad. It just means I have a taste. I'll go really deep into that taste until something else catches my eye, and then go on a spiral in there. So something I've noticed in my nonfiction reading is I don't have many scientific nonfiction books in my repertoire to suggest or even put into my top books because they're just not there. I just haven't read many at all. I mean, I've read The Radium Girls, but I wouldn't say that's a favorite. That's just a book I enjoyed. And that's about it, if I'm gonna be honest. That's just what happens. Maybe I'll go on a science kick next year, who knows? So as you're watching this, just know that my top books are more on a social exploration kind of nonfiction. And that's just the kind of reader I currently am. And these books are gonna be in no particular order, and I am going to be cheating because as I give you my top nonfiction books, in no particular order, I'm also going to be recommending books that are very similar to some of these books because I just couldn't help it because they're still good. Maybe they're just not the top book. So look forward to that as well. So without further ado, let's get into it. I've talked about this book before. In fact, I just mentioned it. My favorite nonfiction book of all time, and it is in my top 10 books of all time, is 5 Days at Memorial by Sheri Fink. Now, I have not read it in a while, and I really do need to reread it. But one of the reasons why it is my favorite book of all time is because Sheri Fink is giving you a ton of information, and she's giving you many sides of this incredible story, but she is leaving it up to you at the end to maybe do your own research as well and decide if some of these acts are condemnable, both. But this book in particular is about Hurricane Katrina and deep diving into Memorial Hospital, which is a hospital in New Orleans. But you're looking into this hospital and the acts that some of these doctors did that they may or may not have euthanized some of these patients that they were supposed to be looking after, and whether or not that was an act of mercy or murder. And so you're going through this book, you're looking at the facts of Hurricane Katrina, the facts of the declining conditions at this hospital and the declining care that these doctors and nurses could give to their patients, and the 5 days of hell, honestly, that these people had to endure to try to survive. And if things went so bad that their triage ended up killing patients on their own, or if these doctors killed these patients. And Sheri Fink does a wonderful job telling all sides of the story and whether or not Memorial Hospital became a disaster zone, to say the least. I loved this book, and I have honestly tried to get my hands and spend time to read her other book, Shock Doctrine, and I just haven't been able to yet. But I highly suggest this book. This is one of my top books. And if you're looking for another awesome book on Hurricane Katrina that looks at the racism side, I would suggest Come Hell or High Water by Michael Eric Dyson. Also a wonderful book. Now, this next book that I want to recommend, and is one of my top books, is one that I actually just read. Was it last week? It might have just been last week. And it quickly rose to my top. It's called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Beverly Daniel Tatum. This book was phenomenal. Tatum is an educational educator. Anyway, she is well known for her work on social justice and teaching future educators about classroom settings and how to teach, point blank. And she actually wrote this book 20 years ago and released it to wide acclaim, yada, yada, yada. It was a good book. And then she still got this question a couple years ago saying, is this still a question on why are all the black kids sitting together? Why didn't we solve racism? Isn't it better? So she felt obligated to re-release this book with new facts, new information, and just updating it with the last 20 years of information. Because yes, it's still a relevant question. Why are kids grouping together, and why is racism still relevant? Because it is. And it's not just for educators. The facts that she brings to the table are very important and very relevant to every single person in the United States, and we should be discussing it openly and honestly in order to move forward. Because if a book 20 years ago is still relevant, then there's clearly issues that we should be talking about in order to move forward in our society. But she delivers every single fact in clear, concise ways, but also giving personal anecdotes in order to explain her point. And you can tell where she's inserted facts from the last 2 decades, but also where facts were relevant in the 1990s. It was just a wonderful book and great overview. So many tabs and so many things that I'd love to reread. Maybe not tomorrow, but maybe in the summer, so I can really sit down with it again and digest it. Wonderful. And if you're looking as a companion book or something more to read, I really suggest White Fragility by DiAngelo, which talks about how white people in particular, protect themselves from talking about racism under this guise of white fragility, and how whiteness is now just like a cover. And also How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram x Kendi. Beautiful book on the history of racism and maybe a future society imagined without racism in it. Both wonderful books that would really complement this one in itself. Now, my next top nonfiction book is a really difficult one to read, actually, but so important and so informative. Is A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide by Samantha Power. This book discusses the origin of the word genocide, the Holocaust, and how it was so difficult to even declare genocide a thing, and then how since then the United States has never declared an act of genocide, even though there have been so many cases of that singular, not even a singular, how there have been so many cases of genocide since, and even after Samantha Power wrote this book. But she discusses how how after the world has declared never again, how these acts of tragedy happen again and again and again and again, and it's just allowed to slip by. And how that is just unacceptable in her mind, and how each one of those tragedies could have been prevented if even just one country had stepped in, but yet continue. Again, it's a very hard read, but such a powerful book. And honestly, I don't have a suggestion on if you're looking for this book, because I read it and I was just I was drained. So I stopped at this one. But if you have any suggestions about problems or world atrocity books, I would be very interested. So leave a comment and read Samantha Power's book. My next top nonfiction book is A Different Mirror, A History of Multicultural America by Ronald Takaki. I'm a history teacher. I love history as well. I just don't teach it. And if you've opened up a history textbook in a high school, even 10 years ago, you know that they're god awful. And so I picked up this book to find different stories that are actually relevant to our children, and that they would see themselves in the United States history. And Takaki does a beautiful job finding stories from people that aren't white. Go figure. He looks at multiracial America and finds the history that is not told and tells it. And then he looks at personal stories and tells personal stories from people. And yes, it's a doozy, but it is worth it if you're looking at something like that. And it isn't a micro history, it is a macro history, and he tells the whole thing from Native Americans to 2000 around. So not the most recent presidencies, not even 9/11, and that is okay. But it is so important to see diverse America, not just white America. And I do suggest it. Now, the typical United States history book that's this thick is Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. And that is a good book, don't get me wrong. And they do have good individual stories, but it is majority white people that he tells about. If you're looking for more personal stories too, I would suggest A Young People's History of the United States or Young People's A Different Mirror. Both excellent, and they're at a younger reading level if you're looking at kids' versions of these histories. I don't know where you're looking into, but either way, this one is a phenomenal book. Now, my next book is one that I read on audio, which was fantastic, and I highly suggest doing it that way. But it's called The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. And it is about the Great Migration that happened from 1915 to 1970 of about 6 million Black Americans from the South to the North. And it came in about 3 waves. And Wilkerson does an amazing job of searching for individual stories of the choices people made, how it affected them, and what their new life was in the North compared to their life in the South. And then the history of 6 decades of this movement of people. She looks at specifically 3 people and does extensive interviews throughout this whole story to really deep dive into the personal aspects of this migration. And it is a beautiful story, heartbreaking story of this movement. I can't say enough good things about this story. Well, not good things. The book itself, I can't say enough good things, but it is heart-wrenching at some points to hear the stories, and heartwarming at some points too, on how people are helping each other. It's just a really good read, and Wilkerson is just a wonderful, wonderful writer. She recently came out with another book called Caste, and it's about America's unspoken caste system that relates to race as well, and it is just as phenomenal. I just ended up choosing The Warmth of Other Suns because that was my first book by her, but I would hands down recommend either of those books to anyone, ever. Now, number 6 on this list is another book I listened to on audio, and it's a memoir. I'm sure some of you have heard of it at some point if you're in the bookish community, but Becoming by Michelle Obama. I cannot say enough good things about this book. Michelle Obama narrates this book herself on audio, and it's beautiful. She tells almost her life story up to when she wrote it, and how she grew up. She had the support of her family. She became a lawyer in school. She met Barack, and I don't know. She just does such a good job of analyzing her life and explaining what's happening, yet feeling so here's what it is, this is what's happening, and this is why. That it was just such a wonderful memoir, and there's a really good reason why it's been such a successful book. It's just good. And it is really heartwarming, and it just, Michelle Obama is a very successful woman for very good reasons. She's very intelligent, she's very caring, and she's just very strong. And it really comes out in this book. And I suggest it if you haven't read it. And I suggest the audio version because you get to listen to the voice of the author. And I love that about memoirs, if they choose the author to narrate them themselves. Because she's Michelle Obama. Why not? Right? Now, if you're looking for other memoirs, I personally enjoyed Educated by Tara Westover. It's another very headstrong woman that really educates herself. It's all about the seeking out of education. I need to find a different word. But she grows up in a very religious household where her father kind of shelters her and her brothers and sisters. And the first time she really goes to school is when she's 17, when she goes off to college, because she chooses to go to college despite what her parents want. And just kind of her journey through discovering kind of what society is after leaving home for the first time and finding out some of her homeschooling was completely false. And then continuing on to her master's program, her PhD program, despite not really having a formal education. It was a very interesting read and a very interesting memoir. And then another memoir I would suggest is Hillbilly Elegy by DJ Vance. It's about a young man who grows up in very poor Appalachia and decides to go out. He joins the army, he gets a high college education and goes back and kind of reflects on that upbringing and how he still really loves his family and the places that he grows up and hates how they're portrayed in media. And that's kind of why he wrote it. So another, at least in my opinion, another really good memoir. So number 7 on my list is The Black Presidency by Michael Eric Dyson. And I've mentioned his book before on this list, if you didn't notice that. But this is, let's start with this. Dyson is an amazing writer, and he is very upfront and just outspoken about the racism he sees in society. And yes, so he takes a look at Barack Obama's 8 years in presidency and how the racism of the media and just other people might have affected it and did affect it, and how that pendulum swings, right? You have a very, very young, progressive Black president, and then the pendulum swings to Trump, who is very old, white, conservative, that kind of thing. And so Michael Eric Dyson looks at what President Barack Obama had to deal with on a daily basis in terms of his race. And it's a very, very interesting look, especially considering Barack Obama is our first Black president. And for this book, Michael Eric Dyson was able to interview Barack Obama, social look into the presidency in this specific case. And it was very insightful and also really heartbreaking to see. Nevertheless, I really enjoyed reading it, and it was just a really insightful book, I guess you could say. But it is one of my top nonfiction books right now. And then my last top nonfiction book is kind of a weird one. I read The Republic of Pirates by Colin Woodard a couple years ago, and I couldn't tell you why I started getting into pirates, but I did. And I thought this book was incredibly interesting. I can explain to you why, but it is a very hard look on what piracy and really life on a wooden ship, whether it's naval or pirate, would have been like in the Caribbean at the height of the 18th century. And he explores everything from disease to shipwrecks to punishments on a ship to just agreements crews would make, and just looking at the social aspects of what a ship would be like on a pirate or naval crew was incredibly fascinating. And I couldn't, again, it's one of my top books still years later, and I'm weird, I know, I can't explain it, but I'd recommend it to you. I don't apologize. But those are my top nonfiction books. I, again, cheated. Definitely put a lot more than 8 books in there because I can. And I hope this video was insightful to you. If you have any recommendations, I will gladly take them. Have a wonderful day. If you liked this video, please give me that thumbs up and subscribe. Have a wonderful Nonfiction November, and I will see you next time. Bye.